Okay, let's go ahead and get started.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sam Crane, the Lead Wheel Director at the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, and welcome to our panel on autism and the LGBT community. On our panel, my pronouns are she or they. On our panel, we have Vivian Lee, who does not use pronouns. We have Annie Segura, whose pronouns are she or they. We have Victoria Rodriguez Roldan, whose pronouns are she, her, and hers. We have John Marble, whose pronouns are he, him, and his. And we have Donnie. I actually don't have Donnie's last name written down. Donnie's pronouns are they, them, and theirs. So I will get us started by having everyone come and just briefly introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about the work you're doing. Annie.
All right. Hello, my name is Annie Segura, also known as Annie Eleni on the internet. My pronouns are she or they. I identify as queer or lesbian. I'm autistic. I have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and a long list of related conditions. And I'm an ambulatory wheelchair user, meaning that I use a wheelchair a lot of the time, but do have a limited ability to walk. I am a speaker, writer, and content creator on YouTube, as well as other social media platforms, including Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok.
All right, thanks, Annie. And next, I guess let's go on to Vivian.
Hi, hello everyone, I'm Vivian. Just Vivian is preferred, but they them is fine. I'm a queer, multiply disabled, racialized settler, calling in from the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. I'm also a part-time AAC user. A visual description of myself, I'm a fairly tan-skinned East Asian person with short black hair and glasses, wearing a dark blue shirt. Most people know me from my work with Autistic United Canada. We're a grassroots volunteer-run collective doing advocacy, education, and outreach, community care, peer support. Currently, we have chapters in BC, Alberta, Manitoba, and Nova Scotia, and an ever-growing network of autistic youth and adults across so-called Canada. So we advocate on the local, provincial, and federal level regarding access to education, employment, housing, immigration, justice, and healthcare. Some things we do, like a no-fee lending library for fidgets, STEM toys, and books written by autistic people, workshops, celebrations for Autism Acceptance Month and Autistic Pride Day, and sensory-friendly intergenerational community events. Some of the other things I'm involved with, I'm a longtime member of the Vancouver Queer Spoon Share, which is a mutual aid group by and for disabled queer and trans people. That was created by Matsui and Deru and Logan Trudeau. And I also study neuroscience at Simon Fraser University, conducting research on autism acceptance, mental health, sensory issues, and speech there. With a bunch of other disabled and neurodivergent students, I help run the SFU Disability and Neurodiversity Alliance. I'm also an alumni of ASAN's Autism Campus Inclusion Program. And I'm realizing that I wrote a lot for each of these questions, so feel free to cut me off. I tend to also ramble when I'm nervous.
That's fine, Vivian. We will move on now to John.
Hey everybody, I am John Marble. I am in San Francisco, California. My pronouns are he and him. I am gay, bisexual, and my work now, I own a company called Pivot Neurodiversity, which helps companies understand neurodiversity and to support their neurodiverse employees and looking at their hiring and retention system as it relates to neurodiversity. Also do art. And I have a long background in LGBTQ queer organizing. And for about 7 years, I worked in the Obama administration as a presidential appointee, doing a bunch of different things. But for a long time, I ended up working on a lot of LGBT stuff. So working on the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, expanding healthcare for transgender Americans. And so, yeah. Oh, and I'm autistic and a couple other disabilities as well.
All right, Victoria.
So Victoria Rodriguez Roldan, I identify as trans, bi, or lesbian, depending on how I'm feeling that day. And also autistic, coming to face that identity crisis and egg cracking in the last couple of years. After a mental health record that is longer than my arm, but another story. Most of my work is centered around LGBTQ issues, especially trans issues, and the intersection of the LGBTQ rights and disability rights, especially around mental health and intellectual disabilities. As a day job, I currently work as a senior policy manager at AIDS United around HIV and public health issues. And before that, I led the Disability and Trans Justice projects at the National LGBTQ Task Force. So yeah, here I am. And for description's sake, brown colored, light skinned Latina woman, pink headphones, pink glasses, white shirt with a blazer.
All right, and Donnie.
My name is Donnie T.C. Dingone. My pronouns are they and theirs. I am gay, non-binary, and multiply disabled. I am a journalist, a freelance graphic designer, a peer health educator and advocate, and a Master's of Public Health student. My specific research and advocacy interests are increasing healthcare access and decreasing health disparities in autistic adults and adult AAC users. Within that, I focus on sexual and reproductive health care and fighting stereotypes and stigma around autistic adult sexualities. I am also a part-time AAC user who is much better a writer than a speaker.
All right, thank you, Donnie. And let's move on to some of our questions for our panelists. Our first question is, how do you conceptualize the relationship between your autistic identity and your sexuality or gender identity? And do they connect or interact? And do we have someone who's desperate to go first? All right, I will call on someone then. How about Vivian? Vivian, you are at the front of my list of people on the screen, so that's why I keep calling on you first.
I can take one for the team. I have things written up at least. So yeah, growing up, I was always given the assumption that autism and LGBTQ2IA+ identity are completely separate. Like, sure, you could be autistic and you can be LGBTQ, but they're completely disparate parts of you. They don't overlap. Actually, recently, an autistic queer friend of mine, Mia, said that disabilities don't add up, they multiply. And I think that's really true of any intersection. So like right now, I don't think I could imagine myself not being autistic and queer and trans all at the same time and mixing in very messy and wonderful ways. Definitely they do connect for me. It's hard to tell, like, when I'm thinking of this interaction with another person, am I viewing it through an autistic lens or a queer one? If I'm viewing it in a way that's different from the norm, like the straight gaze and so on. So really it's both, and it's hard to disentangle. I'm not gonna have typical relationships with other people and with my own body and sense of self, it's all a mess, and then that's okay. Though I don't often use them for myself, I really like the terms like gender vague, neuroqueer, and neurotrans that have come out of autistic and neurodivergent communities. I feel like really resonate for me, even though I don't often use them. And learning that a lot of other people think they're connected and coming to that conclusion for myself and my own identity, it really no longer comes to a surprise to me when I start to hear stuff like, oh, over 70% of autistic people are LGBTQ+, or like autistic people are 6 times more likely to be trans. Our communities overlap so much, so that it's really, I think the question is, how do you even disentangle them? Is that really necessary?
All right, thanks, Vivian.
I think I can go next because
yeah.
the whole disabilities multiplying made me think of God creating disabilities and then saying, go forth, be fruitful and multiply. Like, picture that for a second, to all disabilities. And I would say that one of my biggest concerns around the intersection is how the extent to which it is ignored, basically. I would say that we routinely have, as a society, when I say we, this conception of disability that is basically the photogenic straight white guy in a wheelchair, and we occasionally find a gay guy for diversity points, basically. And in the process, we bound what I call the non-sexy disabilities of the group picture, like the autistic community, mental health, everyone who doesn't fit the photogenic bit, like disfigurations and so on. And in the process, you're leaving out a lot of people, and that applies to both the LGBTQ community that generally is so often inaccessible. And that also comes in many mainstream disability organizations that are so, I want to say pale, stale, and male, but also very straight, basically. So yeah.
Thanks, Victoria. Annie?
Yeah, I have like kind of 2 answers split in half in my brain right now, but also I forgot to say a visual description. So let me do that now. I'm so sorry. I am recording from my room. It is decorated with blue, white, and gold decorations. I am a person with light brown skin. I'm wearing 2 braids and I have black hair, and I'm wearing a pink dress shirt buttoned all the way up with blue cactuses on it. But to answer your question, first, that question kind of like blows my mind, with the first part being like, how do I conceptualize the relationship between the two? Because I took it real literal. I'm like, are you asking me about the biological like relationship between the two? I was like, I don't know anything about that, but I do have a pretty strong community of people who are also queer and neurodivergent, to the extent that I do wonder about that all the time, how they could be connected in that way. But for the most part, I just feel like I'm very lucky to have such a strong community of queer and neurodivergent friends. But then in thinking about how they interact, one way that I find that they interact personally is definitely regarding our romantic and sexual relationships, and how the dating world can be really difficult for neurotypical people and for straight people and cisgender people, but for neurodivergent folks and LGBT people, there is so much more that feels like uncharted territory, which can be pretty cool because you could make up your own rules, but that's also really overwhelming to think that that's something that you can do. And it can just kind of like halt us in place, or at least it does for me sometimes. Like on my first date with my ex-girlfriend, I was really nervous, and so I had a lot of difficulty just like even looking in her direction at all, in her face at all. And I I don't know. She really didn't know what to do. I think she thought I was not interested. And thankfully, she texted me about it later and we cleared it up. But like the little things like that, like of how I personally feel like, I don't know if this is everyone's narratives. I worked really hard to like learn how to have successful social relationships. It was a really difficult learning process. But then when it comes to relationships that are sexual or romantic, like that's something that is like a level up a little bit in regards to my knowledge about it and my practice with it. I think that's a big key, is like in typical relationships, like friends, platonic relationships, work relationships, I get a lot of practice with that, but with different kinds of relationships I don't. So that's what makes it all the more intimidating, I think. So I would say that being neurodivergent, autistic, and being queer and non-binary, like that would be how they interact for me.
Thanks, Annie. Let's move on to Donnie.
So first, a quick visual description. I am a white person sitting in front of a white wall and a window. I have short brown hair and am wearing a black shirt. I have a black, white, and gray necklace with a green speaker hanging from it. As for your question, I can't separate the way my brain works from how I experience sexuality. Because sexuality and attraction are so connected to interaction with others, the way I conceive of my sexuality is shaped by my disabilities, many of which affect my ability to interact in social situations. I struggle with social cues, which, as you can imagine, is not particularly helpful in romantic situations. And a huge part of what I struggle with is that I cannot tell whether the cues I don't understand are things everyone struggles with or if it's just my brain. So as a young queer person fumbling their way through college and graduate school, at least before the pandemic, I would receive dating advice from people and have to tell them that literally does not work for my brain. I would tell people my brain does not interpret social situations in the way most people's brains do. Like, I would have people tell me, just try dating apps, and I would have to say, no, if I try that, my brain will short circuit the first time someone messages me and I'll be a mess for days. And that has a huge effect on the way I understand my sexuality. When it comes to gender, I can't say for certain what connections there are. I guess what I can say is that my gender is messy, my brain is messy, and I'm okay with both of those. Maybe if my brain was a little more orderly, I'd be able to label my gender in a neater way. But I can't, and that's just fine.
Thanks, Donnie. I like that. I like that last point about being messy, because I feel like that a lot. And I'll move on to John.
Ooh, what Annie and Donnie said is like hitting me, and I'm thinking like next year we need to have a panel just on dating. Maybe we can do one for Valentine's Day or sooner. Ooh, kind of hitting me a little bit. And just a visual description, I'm a white man with a beard and dirty blonde hair, and I'm wearing a blue shirt, and I have kind of a background of green mountains behind me. So yeah, let me answer two ways that question. The first way, so I am 43 right now. I came out when I was 21, which it hit me this year that I've now been out longer than I have not been out, which is a scary thing in some ways. And I am of an age that I was not diagnosed as autistic as a child. A lot of kids 5 years younger than me started to be diagnosed more. And also when I came out, I came out at a time where it was illegal to be gay and we worried about the police arresting you. And I came out, lost my job, lost most of my friends, a lot of my family. And in some ways, I'm very thankful that I came out first as gay before I understood myself as autistic and came out as autistic, because it provided me a roadmap of how to come out as autistic myself in so many ways, about what resources I needed, about how to advocate for myself, about how a lot of times when you come out, you can get just really excited. And I remembered when I came out as autistic, wanted to protest every Autism Speaks event. And then I reminded myself, John, remember when you came out as a gay man and you were so excited that you joined the Lesbian Avengers and you're the only male member. Like, you don't have to protest everything. You can pick and choose. So I'm eternally grateful for that. I've also, it's my sexuality and autism has interacted in so many unique ways. For 10 years, I would produce pride parties in Washington, DC. I live in San Francisco now. And I always joked that what is somebody with severe, with sensory sensitivities do, and different socialization do, throw 5,000 person dance parties that I could be in the back in a quiet room managing. And so like doing things like that automatically, informed me about how to make spaces and queer places more accessible for all sorts of disabilities there. And being in San Francisco, we have a queer autistics group. It's the first city that I've lived in that prior to COVID, I could go out and have like catty gay autistic conversations with like queer people that I see. It's just wondering like if somebody over there, like we think that person's autistic and be like, what do you think about her? It's like, oh, notice she couldn't take the lights and the sound and she had to go home early. It's like, I think she's one of us. And I'm like, are we having catty queer autistic conversation culture? And that's been a wonderful thing. At the same time, and I'll try not to go long, I wasn't going to talk about this, but Annie and Donnie both hit this point. I have been out for 21 years. I have yet to have a boyfriend. And it's so much because of how I socialize is as an autistic person. And my life is filled with wedding receptions of crushes where one of the grooms was a crush of mine. And they would tell me like, John, I tried to ask you out for years. And I'm like, no, I did not know that you tried to ask me out for years. And I think a lot of times as autistic people, because our socialization can be different, I at least find myself so hungry and desperate for genuine friendships that I don't know how to read all the flirtation and everything around that. So like I focus on making somebody my friend first. And thankfully, as a gay bisexual man, gay culture is a little bit more forward when it comes to sex. But when it comes to dating, like I've been on so many dates with people that I wish I was on a date with, and I had no idea that I was on a date with. I've also been on third dates where I meet somebody's partner and their dog, and I'm like, oh, we were just hanging out and having a good time. And so like there's no model for me there. And so that's one thing that I haven't seen discussed a lot that I would love to see discussed more. And I'll just end that the benefit of being out here in San Francisco, it's also the first place queer and straight culture out here. I will tell people that I meet out that I'm autistic, and it's just like, oh, okay. And like, I've never had that experience before. So that's a good thing as well. So yeah, I am down for any future panels about dating.
How to date as an autistic person. Very difficult.
Yeah, most of my autistic friends in San Francisco are queer, and I would say that the majority of them are in relationships with kids. And I'm like, how did I, like, where do I find that? Like,
I'm going to say as a queer autistic person, the only relationships I've successfully had were just very close friendships that somehow morphed into, oh, hey, we've been screwing each other for several weeks now. Maybe we're together, basically. I have never managed to work out the dating bit, basically.
How do you navigate like that? I'm so terrified of like choosing the wrong way. Does that make sense? Like I don't know.
You're also autistic, so.
Oh, well, that helps.
No, I have never dated anyone who wasn't autistic or didn't come out as autistic after I dated them.
You know what? I wonder about that. I met a guy last year who I fell head over heels for, and I was talking with my friend Kid about him. My friend Kid is not autistic. He's just a sassy gay man. And I was telling him all these wonderful qualities about this guy, and Kid just says, sounds like he's autistic to me. And I'm like, no, he's just, oh my word, he is autistic. And like, I do find like the people that I do connect with at some point down the line, it's like, oh yeah, like they're autistic. I'm so glad you said that.
I like married the first non-autistic person I dated. But not because she wasn't autistic, but because like it was just a coincidence, but it was just a really different experience dating a non-autistic person.
Sam, I have to tell you that I've been to several weddings or seen like several Facebook posts about engagement where it's somebody that I've long suspected was autistic and somebody who was not autistic. And like, I've seen wedding vows by the non-autistic person talking about all the wonderful autistic traits. And like, they don't realize this person's autistic, but I'm like, you're just giving an autism diagnosis. Yeah. And so I do think that is like, I think a lot of non-autistic people, they might not realize it's autistic traits, but I do find a lot of non-autistic people drawn to the autistic traits that autistic people have.
I'm going to say this one thing because I'm not here to be a panelist. I'm here to be a moderator, and I'm going to move on to the next question. Wait, did everyone answer this question, by the way? John, are you the last person?
I do have a response if there's time.
But okay, I'll get to you, Vivian, but I want to finish my thought. When I went on my second date with my now wife, I told her that I was autistic, and she goes, "Oh, like that, like Sheldon's girlfriend from The Big Bang Theory." And I started like preparing my answer about how that's a stereotype and we're really complicated and we're not all like Sheldon's girlfriend. Because then she goes, because Sheldon's girlfriend is really hot. So I was like, all right, it's kind of like Sheldon's girlfriend. All right, Vivian, go ahead.
Yeah, to be honest, I think dating is particularly fraught for me because I crave platonic relationships as someone on the spectrum. So, like, what was said earlier, I think by John, about like, how do you choose? How do you choose between a friend versus someone you're dating? And like the ambiguity about that. For me, if I could just date all my friends, that would be fine with me, right? Because I can't really tell the difference. I guess dating for me, I don't know if this is because of my sexuality or because I'm autistic, it's we've made a commitment to be with someone, right? But we also make that same commitment with friends, particularly close and intimate friends. So I'm like, shrug, what do we call it? I just want to be nice with people and care for them. So yeah, I think the reason why we tend to label then is because society likes those labels. It helps people slot you two together in a certain box so that we can understand how you're interacting with each other. And there's like institutions like marriage to throw in with that. And for me, I would just do away with all it and just be nice to people.
I had the similar situation because I was and this kind of goes into talk about like monogamy and polyamory as well, because I I was like, well, okay, if dating is like being friends, but you're also romantically attached, like, why can you only date one person? And so that's been complicated.
You know, Sam, I was, and please, if I'm accidentally like stepping over when I'm talking, please let me know. Sometimes I have difficulty realizing that. You know, being here in San Francisco, ended up hanging out and talking with this guy who was in a polyamorous relationship and had like 3 boyfriends. And I said, okay, like I'm trying to explain, understand this, explain this to me. And you know, he had a long explanation, but he boiled it down to, look, when I am with somebody, I try to be present for them and engaged with them. And I thought, you know what? Like, I can do that even with platonic friendships as well. And so I started to just be like loving and engaged and present with the people that I meet. And it started helping me a lot. I'm like, wow, I wish I would have I've learned that lesson a long time ago. But at some point, like we need to figure out our own autistic models that are different from what we're taught in school.
Right. So I do want to make sure that we get to all of our questions. So I am going to move on. And our third question is, how can we work to make sure our spaces do not exclude or harm people on the basis of marginalized identities such as disability, sexuality, or gender, race, etc.? And how can we make the joy of being in a community together possible for people who have multiple marginalized identities? I see Donnie smiling, so I'm going to call on them.
So I have a lot to say on this one. Bear with me here. There is a consistent misconception within disability spaces and disability services that disabled people cannot be queer. Although the number and quality of resources for LGBTQ plus disabled people are increasing, the existing resources tend to assume that we are all straight and cisgender. There is also the assumption that we all want to achieve a stable, monogamous marriage, even though that assumption is not made for non-disabled people. There is significant ableism in queer communities, both on a tangible access level and a policy level. When our spaces are so heavily entwined with party culture, bars, and alcohol, this excludes people who cannot be in those spaces. Aside from this year, I have attended San Francisco Pride every year since 2015. Every single year, I end up exhausted, overloaded, and unable to cope in the aftermath because of the sensory assault. I know that there is more to queer community than parties and pride parades, but I am always so disappointed that so many of our community and pride events seem to not consider access needs or tag questions about access needs on as an afterthought. And then there is the privileging of typical bodies and minds, just like everywhere else. But in queer communities, it is the same rejection painted rainbow, and it hurts even more. And the policy aspect is how achievements in LGBTQ plus policies exclude many disabled people. We talk about the national legalization of same-sex marriage as an achievement, and it is an achievement, but it is not marriage equality. It is not equality when disabled people cannot get married without losing benefits. It is not equality when it is only open to certain LGBTQ plus people. Or how we talk about the outlawing of conversion therapy, but do not discuss how ABA is just a different kind of conversion therapy. Outside of disabled queer communities, these issues are rarely discussed. It all stings so much. One of my special interests is the sociology and history of HIV. If you want to know how the LGBTQ plus and disabled communities are undeniably linked, look to the history of the AIDS crisis. Look at who worked, struggled, and died to make sure people living with HIV received disability benefits, and to make sure HIV/AIDS was included explicitly as a protected condition in the ADA. And yet people still act like these are separate communities with no shared history. I also want to talk about how queer autistic AAC users are especially affected. We are so often not given language for our identities because it is assumed we won't need it. People assume we can't possibly be queer because of how we communicate. We are denied the language our speaking peers are given. If we used symbol-based AAC, our symbols often do not reflect our identities. And every time I bring this up to non-AAC users, particularly non-queer, non-disabled people, I am praised for talking about it. But nothing ever changes. I am tired of having to choose between my identity, my communication, and my time and energy.
Thanks, Donnie. That was really true. All of that was true. I cannot believe. And especially when people pick and choose what we can communicate about, it's just, it's a serious problem, but it's especially a problem for people who don't match what other people expect us to be. Move on to, let's switch this all around. I'm going to go to Victoria next.
So at the risk of sounding like a complete and total scatterbrain, can you repeat the question?
Okay. I will, just a sec. I have to get it. How can we make sure that our spaces do not exclude or harm people on the basis of marginalized identities, such as disability, sexuality, or gender, race, etc.? How can we make the joy of being in the community together possible for people who have multiple marginalized identities?
I mean, it can be as simple as being aware of it. Like, we keep, for example, when we engage in advocacy, we keep seeing here's trans stuff, here's LGBT or disability, over here, sorry, I'm showing all my pill bottles. Over here is racial justice, and they will never, ever, ever intersect. And in reality, it's more of a big ball of wibbly wobbly, activisty, whiny stuff, basically.
Victoria, you nearly made me spit out my tea. So it's a good thing you didn't succeed, because I was going to bill you for it, whatever I spit my tea out on.
Yeah, but we need to see it as a single overall social justice movement. We need to move beyond a rights-based perspective more towards a social justice-based perspective. Because like Donnie said, a lot of the advocacy is leaving people out. Is conversion therapy banning conversion therapy inclusive if you're leaving out adults under guardianship, for example, from the statute? And Sam and I worked a lot on the DC statute that makes it the only one in the country that bans conversion therapy for adults under guardianship. Is it really inclusive advocacy if you're not counting everybody who is there, if you're not making it cognitively accessible, for example? And I can keep on going. And yeah, guardianship is essential, as Turtle is saying. I like that username. So one thing I would add to that, how to make ourselves, our communities loved and intersect, is to constantly be on the lookout to make things more accessible and to constantly not leave things behind. We need to talk about the relationship between the struggle against ABA therapy and conversion therapy, for example. We need to talk about all those things, and we just aren't, because we keep seeing it as here's disability, here's LGBTQ, and they will never ever come together, even so we mix them and drink them together. So yeah. I just made a demonstration with pill bottles. That's weird as hell, but you know.
Yeah. I feel you on pill bottles though. I have so many. I'm gonna move on to John. I'm going back to front this time.
Yeah, I would say empower and censor people with marginalized identities. I think that goes a long way to actually building inclusion. I had mentioned that I had helped produce a Pride party in DC for about 10 years, and we started that party. If you live in Washington, DC, or have been to DC Pride, you've probably seen there's like tons of events and parties. When we started that, there's like one party for men that was mostly white men, and there's one party for women over like Pride weekend. And so we started a party, and not consciously, we just happened to be a group of queer people who are either people of color or disabled. And because of that, like we have always had chair users at our party. We've always had people with intellectual disabilities at our party. We've always had a diverse group of party goers. And it wasn't anything that we consciously did. It was just the people in charge happened to be a diverse group of people. And we made a lot of mistakes, but that lesson taught me that, oh yeah, if you let people design things for themselves, and if that core nucleus is diverse, like that's gonna happen. And I can tell you another lesson that I learned is that there's so much joy and privilege and in being a white man. And let me finish that statement. I just heard how it sounded coming out. I think for a lot of white people, and especially a lot of white men, the first time you hear the concept of privilege, you tend to recoil from it. It's like, well, I'm not, that person. I've had a hard life and all sorts of things. But once I realized that privilege was this capital that you could spend for other people and redistribute on behalf of other people, it became such joyous work for me. So now, like, I can tell you, like, with COVID, I had a serious COVID illness. I almost died from it. I was out of commission for like 4 months. It's strapped for me financially right now. So when I get invitations to like paid panels by companies, my first inclination is like, oh yes, I can educate, I can get paid for this, I can pay my rent for this month. But to be able to say, by the way, I do not do all male panels. I do not do all white panels. If you have a problem with that, I'm not your person. Let me connect you to some autistic people of color and autistic women and non-binary people who can do this instead of me. That is so joyous. And I realized that the impact that I want to have as an autistic person and as a disabled person, if I pass that opportunity that I received to other people, or if I take the spotlight, I don't know the metaphor to use, if I take the spotlight that I'm given and shine it to other people, like that can be a faster way of impact than maybe what I could do myself. So whenever we're organizing with queer spaces or disabled spaces or autistic spaces, if we make like the organizer, the nucleus themselves more diverse, that's how we can be more inclusive. And it's the exact same principle of why, like, you can tell almost now if an autism group or a conference has autistic people involved in it by how white it is and how like mainstream it is, without even knowing who all the autistic people are, because that at least as an autistic culture, like we're getting pretty conscious of being like, if we're putting something on ourselves, let's make damn sure that it's including all of us. So a lot of times I'll see an autistic conference or a group, and if it's all white people, I'm like, maybe one autistic person, but I guarantee you that autistic people aren't running it. So that was long-winded. I forget who else said that they were long-winded as well when they get nervous. Was that you, Donnie? So I will stop there. But yeah, for me, it just seems so simple. It's like censor and empower people with marginalized identities. That was the short answer to my long answer.
Thanks, John. I think, so we've gone through John, Donnie, and Victoria. I'm going to go to Annie.
Everyone's already said so many really great things. Johnny, really, especially, I was like, my own little internal audience cheering over here. What I typically discuss, like I just kind of want to piggyback off of what everyone else was saying, and regarding like acknowledgement of intersections, acknowledgement of multiply marginalized folks. And to finish the sentence I started, what I typically talk about is actually like the often ignored like emotional toll of that lack of acknowledgement and that lack of inclusion. For me personally, accessibility and lack thereof has been one of my like really tough emotional tolls. Accessibility wise, I definitely have a tough time finding queer spaces that are accessible to me as a wheelchair user, as well as the fact that most queer spaces, as previously mentioned, are pretty much bars and clubs, and those are going to be incredibly inaccessible for a number of reasons, including the possible triggers of crowds, alcohol, smoke, loud music, and flashing lights. I can personally handle that environment for a while. I do like the environment, but the fact is that it's not very inclusive or welcoming environment to everyone who should feel welcome in that space. And it's tough. Discovering that was tough. I started using a wheelchair around like 2014, so I'm at a weird stage with it where I feel a little bit seasoned and a little bit still of a newbie in regards to my wheelchair. I discovered that my favorite gay bar in my town had a giant flight of stairs, but no elevator. And for some reason, I always assumed that there was some elevator hidden somewhere, but there wasn't. And because I'm an ambulatory wheelchair user, there were a couple of times that even though it was painful and risky, I attempted to climb the stairs. And then when I got to the top, I would just like have a seat for the rest of the evening. The last time I was there, I finally owned a seat cane. So I didn't have to rely on there being an empty seat when I got to the top. I was able to just like hang out on the dance floor with my seat cane and have a seat available to me wherever I went. But that time, a security guard approached me after I'd done the whole thing, after I parked my wheelchair, climbed up the staircase, had to calm down from the tachycardia that I got from climbing the staircase, and was already kind of settled up there. Told me that I had to move my wheelchair when it had never been a problem before. And when I told them that if I went down to move it, then I wouldn't be able to climb back up, that was not in my abilities. And then he just shrugged at me like, oh, well. So that really messed me up because that communicated to me, we don't really care if you're here. The wheelchair is bumming us out. It's killing the aesthetic, etc. And it just made me feel really unwelcome. And so that's a really like visible thing, the wheelchair, but lack of accessibility is going to make you feel that way anyway.
Mm-hmm.
When you bring it to the attention of someone that an environment is not accessible to you as an autistic person or any other disability that you might have, and then nothing changes, what is being communicated is that they don't care if you're there, and they don't care if you feel unwelcome, and they don't care if you feel excluded. And that's painful. I haven't gone back since, and it really sucks because LGBT spaces often talk about inclusivity and community and family, but constantly exclude their disabled LGBT siblings. So it's really, really sad. It's really unfortunate that we kind of have to like say, acknowledge multiply marginalized people, acknowledge intersections over and over and over again in this panel, because that is the most basic thing that people could do, but they don't. And that's literally just the beginning. That's just a start of having an actual effective social justice movement. So let's do that then.
Thanks, Annie. I mean, I think I felt as like sort of a lawyer when you were telling me about the security guard. My first response was, "Oh my God, that's illegal. He couldn't do that." But then he's already killed your buzz. He's already he's already ruined your night. And so we need to make sure that that just doesn't happen in the first place. I'm going to move on to Vivian. Vivian, do you have
Sorry, I'm
a
just
response?
having some trouble unmuting.
Getting on mute, yeah.
Okay.
This is the
I don't
2020 problem these days.
Yeah. I'm also navigating various screens of like my notes and the stream text and the Zoom. Yeah, I don't have much to add other than to echo the really excellent points already made by the other panelists. Thank you for sharing your personal and often painful experiences. I particularly like Donnie and Victoria's points on like, the history and policy and how these ableist heteronormative systems all work together and how we need to move as one justice movement to address these complex systems. The disability justice framework in particular has really informed a lot of how I think this can be achieved. Principles like leadership of the most impacted and no one left behind. Well, when I got this question, I thought a lot about my personal experiences just within the tiny secluded niches I've found for myself. Because for me, I'm lucky to live in an area with dedicated groups for this intersection, like Chronically Queer and Autistic Queer Collective and the Vancouver Queer Spoon Share. And these are led by people at these intersections, often people of color, and following the disability justice framework. So, and yeah, honestly, I can't speak to how bad the experiences I've had in the mainstream queer spaces because I avoid them. I went to Pride like once recently and had a total sensory overload and meltdown, and I was like, never again. I'm just gonna go back to the circles that I've built for myself and just celebrate Pride in my own way. And some other thoughts on this. Though I really think that there's so much issues with how the queer and trans communities are not welcoming to autistic and otherwise neurodivergent and disabled folks, and how vice versa, the disabled community is really not that LGBTQ plus friendly. I think race plays a way bigger role in how I can't seem to find a space for myself in queer community or autistic community as easily. Like these spaces, autistic spaces, queer spaces, trans spaces tend to be very, very white. It's pretty alienating. Lots of microaggressions, and I think Lydia X said Brown recently tweeted like these microaggressions, they're not small in impact, they add up. And so throughout all these experiences, I feel like I'm done with it all. And I just need to like stick to my small local niches. Like I'm slowly finding a local group of Gaysians that's been really helpful in healing. Turns out a lot of them happen to be autistic and neurodivergent too. And there's some autistic BIPOC groups that I'm part of online. But then at the same time, that's kind of sad, right? Because even though these spaces are really cool and healing and there's a lot of wonderful people in them, it means that I am cut off from the larger communities and the larger movements. And these larger movements don't see the benefits of us as mostly marginalized people in contributing to these like wide-scale advocacy movements and changes. So while I love these spaces, it's also kind of sad that I can't have a community that's really for all aspects of my identity and still have the resources to carry that through. Because these small groups I'm part of, they're 100% volunteer run, chronically underfunded, and just like, we do this for the love of each other, but it's so hard. It's so difficult.
Yeah, it's hard when, in addition, when you've got like these sort of very specific niche groups, they can be really wonderful, but then I think it can also, having been in some of these niche groups, it intersects with dating too, because like if you're in, let's say, San Francisco with like a huge number of like LGBT people, but then you're hanging out with like a very specific group, after a while you've either kind of already dated or decided you're not going to date anyone in the group.
Your pool's so limited.
Right? So we need to be making sure that these like larger spaces are open to. If anyone has other remarks to make on this question, let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to. Yeah.
Yeah, I forget which question it was, but what Vivian said reminded me. One of the best lessons I learned when I was young and I came out, and for a time I was like living in my car. I was taken under the wing of a group of friends who were Black gay men who were in a ball scene, and they would take me to balls, and we'd always hang out like every weekend. And then one day I went over to my friend Tony's house, and we're all getting ready to go out, and Tony was like, "John, why don't you just hang back tonight?" And I'm like, "But we always go out together." And Tony said, "Well, John, like sometimes Black people just need to be around other Black people." And it was a lesson that I got about just like, I mean, as autistic people, we experience the same thing. Like when we're just around autistic people, just that relaxation, or when, women or non-binary people around other people like them, just that relaxation. And I've always thought, like, how do we allow for those spaces, but then also work to make our larger queer culture more inclusive of that? I don't know if I have the answer to it, but it's like something I think about a lot. Thank you, Vivian, for sharing that.
I think that's definitely true as well. We're going to move on and ask, because autistic people face the idea that we need to be cured or made normal. But LGBTQ plus people also face the idea that we're wrong or need to be fixed. I'm going to include ace and aromantic people in that too. Both queer and autistic people can experience abuse for being different or have their self-expression limited by people in power around them, can be restricted from accessing our communities. So let's talk about the commonalities between these two experiences and how both communities can work together and ensure everyone is safe and can express ourselves. Victoria.
That's a big question right there. I would say that one of the crucial things about making people feel safe is essentially trust. I like how John was talking about the whole, sometimes people need to have their own spaces, and to an extent, we need to create welcoming spaces, regardless of whether they're just autistic people or queer autistic people. We need a constant welcoming. Like, we need to talk not just accessibility, but from a radical perspective of it, where we see that accessibility in the form of friendships, in the form of who is being invited. And this is especially true when we talk about mental health. We keep seeing the people, the friends who have mental health disabilities as the flaky one that we don't invite because they never show up. we'll keep inviting them, go to them instead, actually. And I don't mean necessarily that in a harassing way. Please don't take that as a license to stalk people. But you get like, I keep thinking of a need for greater trust, for actually asking people what they need when organizing things, basically, instead of making assumptions. I also think of a need to, how to put it, I'm losing words, but I'm thinking along of the idea of making sure that your welcoming is more than lip service, basically, because otherwise you're not going to go anywhere with it.
Thanks, Victoria. I'm now going to call on Annie.
I feel like a little bit like I would just be echoing the inclusion of multiply marginalized people in like the organizing process is so important, and paying them for their time, hiring consultants, paying them for their knowledge and experiences. And I kind of took your question literally about like I guess, what was the word you used? Like the similarities between the communities.
Yeah.
There's quite a few. Like there's quite a few, and it's kind of an interesting topic to discuss, like kind of in closed settings. Like one example I'll make is like coming out as queer and coming out as disabled, and like personally in my experience, like the most important person I cared about had a negative reaction to each. And when I came out as gay, they cried and accused me of trying to ruin their life and reputation. And when I came home with my diagnoses, I was met with more tears and told that I would use my diagnoses as an excuse to never make anything of myself or to be lazy. So like, there's a lot of little things like that kind of like hold a similar painful place in your heart, in your mind. So there's plenty of experiences to empathize with across communities, and maybe they can bond us, but whether or not we share similar experiences shouldn't impact that. The LGBT community and the disabled community need to be allies to one another, period. So many of us are part of both communities and more, and it is, I think we've said it quite a few times in this panel, but it's beyond exhausting.
Yeah.
Beyond exhausting for a part of ourselves to constantly feel excluded from either community or space. So again, like, I guess the takeaway here is again, kind of trying to shake people awake and make that acknowledgement, make that inclusion, make that effort to reach out and support multiply marginalized people in the way that they need. But and part of that is asking them what they need in the first place, because we can't assume what they need.
No, totally. I'm going to now move on to John.
Okay, two things. One, not to be that San Franciscan who talks about Burning Man, but being a San Franciscan who goes to Burning Man, there's a lot of things wrong with Burning Man that people are working on, but just the concept of radical inclusion. This is the first time in my life that I've had really good straight guy friends here in San Francisco. I also have really great non-autistic friends who want to get autism and what it means to be autistic. And there is a bit of a culture here of like, let me just accept you who you are and go from there. That's been great to kind of let me explore how to socialize with non-autistic people. The back end of that kind of like, and I've gotten really good about being inclusive with other people. there is still a hard lesson for yourself to learn to love and accept yourself, even if you're an autistic advocate like me. Whitney Houston said, learning to love yourself is the greatest gift of all. Lizzo sings a bunch of songs about that. That is the hardest lesson to learn. And it's funny that just as there's microaggressions, there's microableisms that pop up in our lives all the time. I asked a friend who's autistic and straight, like, when do you disclose to someone you're dating that you're autistic? And he was like, right away. Why wouldn't I? And I'm like, oh yeah, why wouldn't I? But it's constantly, you're kind of always, spinning your wheels, making those calculations. And if it isn't the truth that, yeah, it always ends up kicking me in the rear, the more I hide it on the front end of like, this boy is going to see me melt down in a car because the radio is playing on a frequency that's painful for me. And I, like, at that point, how do I explain it? Whereas if I'm just open with myself at the beginning, that is still a hard lesson to learn. And it's a lesson that you have to learn over and over again, and you get better at it, like practice. The second thing is that you had mentioned abuse, and my mind was trying to wrap around it. At some point, maybe this is a separate discussion, but I do find a lot of neurodivergent people, in particular autistic people, kind of, I don't want to say susceptible to abuse, because that means kind of puts it on us. But I think that a lot of times I don't trying to dance around ableist language. And I don't want to say that we're more genuine than non-autistic people, or that we're more trusting, but I find that the autistic way of thinking and socializing a lot of times can lead to abuse of autistic people. It's something by non-autistic people, and it's something that I've experienced in my life, and I noticed it with a good number of autistic friends. So I don't know what the answer to that is, but I think it's worth a discussion at some point about how to navigate that. I'm not sure if that came out clear, but
no, I mean, I think that is something that happens, that like, especially those of us who've been through ABA or who've internalized messages that like, if we have social conflict, it must be that because we've done something wrong. That can definitely make it harder to avoid abuse,
like right now,
and recognize abuse.
The court system, and you're a lawyer, so you'll appreciate me trying to be careful. Having received abuse from somebody, and like just learning how to advocate for yourself in court in a way that translates, and how to say, victim services says, well, there's, $2,000 available if you want to move. And I'm like, how do I explain, like, first of all, in San Francisco, that's not enough money to move, but like, how do I explain, it took me 10 years to prepare to move to San Francisco as an autistic person. Like,
how am I supposed to
move? For a
move?
non-autistic person isn't the same as moving for an autistic person. I don't know how to explain that, but for the autistic people who are listening, probably kind of get that.
I want to add, and this is more the message for the autistic people involved, which is that we are constantly being told the whole, as Sam brought out, you're the one to blame for whatever problems there are. And I wish I had $1 for every time somebody tells me, I'm sorry for whatever access need they have, basically. Apologizes for, can you turn the radio down? I'm sorry about that, basically. And it's like, we need to remind ourselves more that we are valid in ourselves and our true selves and who we are. And that our way of life isn't wrong or something we should apologize for, basically.
That's totally, yeah. We're all taught to apologize for all sorts of things that we need. I have already forgotten who I've called on so far. I think I've called on just John and someone else. Donnie, have you answered yet? Okay, I will call on Donnie.
I want to talk about how I often see this kind of inclusion done and how it goes wrong. Often, people use what I call an assimilationist model of inclusion. I know you have heard of this in disability communities. It is summed up in the statement, well, self-advocates are clearly high-functioning, which we know is completely wrong. We know that nobody is too disabled for self-advocacy. Nobody is too disabled for inclusion. And just like that, nobody is too queer for inclusion. Obvious gender and sexuality nonconformity is not a reason to cast someone out of society. Inclusion is not a privilege. It is a right. We must all work past ideas of fitting in. We all must remember that inclusion and access to the full rights and blessings of humanity is not based in whether someone can appear normal.
Thanks, Donnie. I don't think I've called on Annie. Okay.
I already went.
Okay. And Vivian, have you gone?
Oh no, I can go.
Okay.
So this question is so broad that I just had a bunch of thoughts, and they may not be entirely connected, but I'll just go with it. So when talking about how to, sorry, let me do word thinking. How to connect like the types of violence that autistic people face and the types of violence LGBTQ2A plus people face, and how do we ensure that these communities work together? One thing I suggest is really broadening our understanding of ableism itself, broadening our understanding of access, because they tend to be focused on like just single disability only issues, right? So I actually copied this in my notes. I really like T.L. Lewis's definition of ableism, created in conversation with disabled, Black, and other negatively racialized folks, especially Dustin Gibson. So I'm just going to read it out loud here for reference. Ableism is a system that places value on people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normalcy, intelligence, excellence, and productivity. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in anti-Blackness, eugenics, colonialism, and capitalism. This form of systemic oppression leads to people in society determining who is valuable and worthy based on a person's appearance and or ability to satisfactorily produce or reproduce, excel, and behave. And one of the core things here, you don't have to be disabled to experience ableism. I think that's how we can do this kind of cross-movement organizing, is to recognize that ableism, by definition, is about excluding people on the basis of different bodies and minds. And this applies to women, this applies to racialized folks, this applies to disabled folks, this applies to queer, trans, ace, and aro people. So thinking about access then, like, well, what do we do about access with access as a way to counteract ableism? For me, like norms like sharing pronouns, reminding people about pronouns, not making assumptions about people's bodies and minds based on gender or sexuality. Like that's an access issue too, for trans folks and also just for people like me with cognitive and language issues. Like I have trouble remembering people's pronouns. Reminders are great for me. And thinking about things holistically, like with collective access and access intimacy, finding joy. I think that was something that John mentioned, finding joy and loving each other, making spaces for each other, discovering new ways to do this. That doesn't mean reproducing the same violence and oppressive systems that we fight against. So not doing that assimilation model that I think that was Donnie who mentioned it, but really creating something new that's for ourselves and for each other. I think that's one way to go about it. I had lots of other thoughts about just the historical connection between ABA and conversion therapy. Its roots, like Ivar Lovaas working with George Riekers on applying the same behaviorist principles to enforce gender roles in so-called feminine boys. And also just how ABA is done even to this day is teaching autistic people how to behave in heteronormative gender roles. What you get taught, that's how you're supposed to move through society. And recognizing this also comes from similar patterns of pathologization and subsequent depathologization, say like the removal of certain diagnoses from the DSM regarding trans and gay folks and lesbian and bisexual folks and so on. Though like there's some things about like asexuality that's still in the DSM. Obviously autism is still in DSM. We're decades behind in certain areas and others. Understanding that the conceptualization of autism itself, like just autism as we view it through Western psychology, it is through an extremely gendered lens, one that defines autistic people as in a sort of way as a queer person. Remy Yergo has a lot of thoughts about this in their book. So that's authoring autism. And so that's why we get things like autism is because you have an extreme round brain. Oh, look, we forgot about autistic woman. So there must be some sort of female autism phenotype that researchers have to look for now. And oh, wait, now we're discovering that autistic people tend to be trans and gender diverse and non-binary. Oh boy, what do we do now? So I think that's going to be an uphill battle because the medicalization, the clinical world, it's so entrenched in a gendered view of autism. I think having more engagement between actual autistic folks, particularly autistic folks that are LGBTQ2IA+, like that, engaging with the research. I don't know if anyone has the spoons to do it. I'm in research myself and I'm constantly burned out from it. But if clinical diagnosis is the way people tend to enter our community, that's really something we have to look into. Okay, more thoughts. Sorry, do cut me off if I'm going too long.
I'm gonna give you one more minute and then we have to move on.
Okay. I don't know if people know this, but recently the federal government in Canada is actually pushing for a ban for conversion therapy. So how do we connect that to ABA? How do we get our non-disabled LGBTQIA+ allies to fight with us for this? Some other thoughts, as an AAC user, I'm really struggling with my AAC group these days because of the lack of gender neutral voices, the lack of options. It's really hard to express myself because how we express ourselves for our voices and our tech voices is so core to how other people perceive me. So if I have like this older British woman being my voice with a lot of the world, that's super difficult. We also hear a lot about parents, caregivers, and professionals limiting word banks and symbols that AAC users have access to. Like, how do we talk about gender, sexuality, sexual health, sexual abuse even, without the language to do so? And there's assumptions there about like our ability to even understand those things. That's throughout, it's a common experience for all autistic people, not just AAC users, presuming that we can't understand our own gender and sexual identities. So I'll just stop there.
Thanks.
And hopefully it wasn't too quick.
Those were all really important points, and I'm glad that we had some time for it. But I want to make sure that everyone's answered this question because we have one more question. We have about 10 minutes left.
Okay.
But the last question is going to be pretty general, and I'm going to kind of mix a couple of them together. So our last question is, how can we make the world a better place for autistic LGBTQ people? For example, by fighting stigma against trans autistics, and do you see, maybe more representation of autistic and LGBTQA plus identities, representation in various realms of life? I'm going to go call on John.
So I will use my answer to go back to emphasize what Vivian just said, because I've had these feelings for a long time, but have not had the language, but Vivian just shared it. If we want to make the world better for LGBT autistic people, again, center and empower LGBT autistic people. But what Vivian said about the intersection of disability is something that I felt but have not had the language for a while. I teach autistic young adults, and whenever, I also happen to be, it feels like a welcome wagon for a lot of people. If like, I have a friend, she's trying to figure herself out. Like, we think she's autistic, go talk to John. Whenever somebody is trying to understand themselves as disabled for the first time or as autistic for the first time, and they ask like, what should I read? I always send them to read James Baldwin, because he doesn't write about disability, but he writes about the issue of just normalcy. And there's a particular essay of his that I like called Stranger in the Village, about his time as a gay Black man living in a Swiss village where he was the first Black person that a lot of people saw. He talks about, the exotification of himself, and also the negative attitudes towards himself. But central to that theme is just how utterly odd and bizarre it is to treat anybody as anything but boring and plain based on whatever difference that they have. And so when I think about disability, and Vivian, you had better language than I'm saying here, I think about like, what is racism or sexism but disabling other people through our actions? And I know like every model of disability has its advantages and disadvantages, but one of the things that I like about the social model of disability is that it makes it clear that you're not either racist or not racist, or you're not either ableist or not ableist. We all have actions that we can perform and do. And what can I do to lessen the disability that I apply to a trans person, or a person of color, or a woman, or a non-binary person, or an autistic person? And it's like cleaning up those areas of our lives. And I know it's being real soupy here. I'm gonna go read the transcript to see what Vivian said, because I think that is worth a discussion of its own. So when I think about like, how do we make the world better for LGBT autistic people, is like, how do we make the world better for everybody? That sounds so cliche. but like, how do we build that practice within ourselves to make the world more inclusive? I'm not going to dig myself out of this cliche. Like, there's substance beneath the cliche, but yeah, help me move along.
We are running at the end of our time, so I am going to move on. Thank you, John. And I am going to move on to Annie.
I guess it's time for us to do a little bit of repeating and a little bit of like thinking in regards to, because your main question was, how do we make it better for autistic LGBT folks? And then how do we fight stigma as autistic LGBT folks? So that's kind of, right? It's a nice sandwich of an answer, because for me as an autistic person in the LGBT community, things would be better at the most basic, having equal, equitable rights, including accessibility to all public spaces that everyone else has accessibility to. This is not For me personally, I don't think, but in general, how disabled people who have government aid involved in their lives are fearful of marriage because they will face consequences to whatever aid they are using, and several other healthcare. Holy moly! So we could talk about legal justice and our rights, and then I think right next to it, right sandwiched into it, is any stigma we face, any stereotypes that we face by authentically representing autistic people, and specifically autistic LGBT people. The first time I ever saw that was in the show, I think it's called Everything's Gonna Be Okay, where they have a queer autistic teenager played by an autistic teenager. I don't know if she's queer in real life, but at least by an autistic actress. So that was really cool. And the first person of color who's autistic that I've seen in media was in the Disney Pixar short Loop, which was pretty good. Also voiced by an autistic actress. So very cool. Very cool that they were both femme folks as well, versus like the very saturated mainstream representation of like white autistic men, and usually straight men as well. So I really want it to get shaken up like a snow globe, change it up, diversify, and make it so that people don't see stimming in public as a gawk-worthy situation. You know what I mean?
Thanks, Annie. I'm gonna move on to Donnie. And we only have a few minutes left, so hopefully we can just go. We might have to go a little bit over, but I'm trying to get things moving quickly.
Consistent advocacy and breaking down stereotypes of what autistic identity and LGBTQ plus identity are. When it comes to LGBTQ plus events and spaces, especially as we creep back towards more in-person events at some point, making sure we're including accessibility as a core component. Also, pushing back against the idea that LGBTQ plus events have to look a certain way in order to be legit.
I agree on that. Thank you, Donnie. And
I skipped out on so many parties in college that were full of loud music and strobe lights, even though these were often the heart of campus queer culture. I want a range of LGBTQ plus events and spaces. I want to normalize access needs as a core part of LGBTQ plus communities. I also want to quote two different people here on how queer and disabled people show up everywhere. The first is Martha Shelley, speaking to straight people about the gay community in her 1970 essay, "Gay is Good. You will never be rid of us, because we reproduce ourselves out of your bodies and out of your minds. We are one with you." The second is from Imani Barbarian in a tweet about the pivotal and unappreciated role disabled people played in the 2020 election. And for anyone adding extra groups to disabled, we are a part of you. We are Indigenous, Black, Latinx, queer. LGBTQ plus people are everywhere. Disabled people are everywhere. It is so important that we assume from the beginning that there will be multiply marginalized people in our spaces.
thank you, Donnie. Sorry, I almost cut you off there. I'm going to move on to Victoria.
So I would be very quickly, I'm just gonna say that we need to see all lives as valid. No one is too disabled to be an activist. No one can be excluded. We need to really dig at radical accessibility even when it's difficult to do it, because otherwise you're just leaving people out, basically, and we need to get past that. And I could go more in deeper, but we're trying to cut it out.
Thanks, Victoria. And I have again forgotten who I've already gone to, and I think that the last person to speak is Vivian.
Yes, I can
Yes.
speak, but I'm not sure if the last. First thing that came to mind was to stop it with assuming that autistic people can't be LGBTQ2IA+. Like, we're not confused. We're not being influenced by some kind of scary trans agenda. Well, the scary trans agenda is kind of ours too, because their communities are ours too. We're already here, and I get a lot of concerns from parents and caregivers. Like, what if it's just a phase? Well, even if it's a phase, well, the moon's phases are still hugely impactful on Earth. We still celebrate it among many cultures. Whole systems and economies rely on the moon's phases. They're still important. As well, just fighting, I'm just echoing here, fighting against the othering and pathologization and devaluing of all bodies and minds that differ from the norm. Things like accessible healthcare, employment, housing that take consideration of people at these intersections, but also going beyond access too. So the very way these systems are delivered and constructed are oppressive. It's not just getting access to those existing services, but rethinking them altogether. I don't think this has been mentioned much, but ending carceral spaces in general, because both autistic people and LGBTQ+ people have higher rates of being incarcerated, of being put in like seclusion rooms, as another kind of carceral space, of having our families ripped apart because either from having your family reject you, or because you're deemed incompetent, you have your children taken away. And carceral spaces also rip families apart too. I noticed, I've been trying to read the chat as the panel goes, and I noticed some talk about media representation. And yes, definitely, I'm hard pressed to find a good autistic LGBTQ+ character that's not someone that I like headcanon or something like that. And I think a lot of autistic people and LGBTQ people get into like fandoms, these transformative works, because we're so thirsty for representation. We want to find it wherever we can. And some other notes on like robust mental health support, like finding any therapist with any kind of competency about like trans identity, disabled identity, neurodiversity, and also intergenerational trauma, because this gets passed down. Very hard, very, very hard. I'm lucky if I found someone decent, but access to that even now is very difficult. And to find like a good therapist for all the trauma that the world brings to autistic and LGBTQ+ people. Some last thoughts on like celebrating, like having celebrations for ourselves and our communities. I think that's important because we're so, like, speaking as an activist, we're so focused on like, this is all very negative. We have to fight and we have to fight. And then the burnout hits you so hard. So like acts of loving kindness and just lifting each other up, celebrating each other. Yes, we can do that for visibility purposes, of course, and for making sure all voices are represented. But I think that's just a nice thing to do too. Like we could all use some niceness in our lives. So yeah, that's my ending note. Be nice to each other in a way that really shows you see this person, maybe not see because not everyone sees, but like to witness their pain and their complexity and to really try to be for one another in that way. I think that's so important too.
Thanks, Vivian. And I think that that's a really good way to close out the panel. I think that we have now all spoken and we're a little bit over time. I want to thank everyone. I want to thank our audience who are having a really amazing conversation about She-Ra in the chat, in the comments, and have made this their participation has made this panel so much better. So thank you, everyone, and I hope that you have a good rest of the weekend. Applause for everyone. And